Okay, welcome to our Erev Shabbat Friday Perashat class, Perashat Shemini. It also happens to be Perashat Parah this week, but we're going to focus on the Perashat HaShavua Shemini, which obviously highlights the tragic incident of the death of the sons of Aharon. We, however, are going to focus on what you might want to call the second half of the Parashat, which highlights a general category of mizvot and halachot known as kashrut. And it's quite astounding that out of all the modes of observance that Jewish people choose to enter into, and of all the, you can call labels or standards by which we measure the observance, religiosity, the dedication of a Jew, kashrut is the one that stands out. Usually above others, people ask, is he shomer Shabbat? Is he shomer kashrut? It happens to be that there are plenty of Jews, especially in Eretz Yisrael, that are not shomer Shabbat, but are still, to some extent, devout eaters in Judaism. In other words, to the extent that they know and understand or that they want to be devoted, still keep kashrut and are still observant in dietary laws. And it's so interesting that that has become a symbol of Judaism, and it's really a mundane activity. It's because almost a crude activity. We do what animals do, is ingest and consume, and yet this has become a symbol of the loyal, dedicated, devout Jew, his commitment to dietary laws. And therefore it behooves us to understand the significance behind dietary laws and why indeed that is an activity that is not only not a crude activity, but one that ties us in to God Almighty. It should be noted, needs to be noted, that out of the different categories in which one may be able to group mizvot, that certainly unanimously, with no question, the dietary laws, we'll call them kashrut, the laws of what you may or may not eat, are considered to be chokim. There are laws without a given reason, certainly not in the Torah. And there you can say there are laws without, at least on the surface, any logic, right? It's not necessarily helping someone, doesn't seem to be helping you. It's not nationalistic. It's not historic. It's not symbolic. It's not interactive. Right? It's just, as we said, seemingly somewhat superficial, seemingly somewhat of a crude, mundane activity. So let's talk about why this hok, this mizvah without reason and logic, is one that carries with it so much significance that a Jew himself is sometimes defined by it. Well, we have opinions in terms of the reason for these mizvot that run the gamut. Before we get into them, we should just mention that our parasha pretty much goes through the different categories of species, starting with behemoth, animals, you can call them livestock, and the signs that make them edible, you can say kosher or not, permissible or prohibited. Moving on to fish and the permissible signs on a fish, going into birds and not really giving any signs of what physical symbols of what makes birds, what species of birds are edible and permissible, rather the opposite, names the prohibited birds, and then speaks about species of grasshoppers that are kosher, and then of course moving into the insects that by and large are not kosher. So this basically is the foundational and fundamental parasha for species and permissible species and not, and dietary laws in general. So we start off, batting first is the Rambam in the Moreh Nebuchim. And the Rambam has an extremely practical reason given, one that you often hear people echoing in today's world, especially with the different scientific and medical discoveries and our access to to find that information out on the internet. Simply that whatever behemoth and hayot and dagim and alfot and birds and fish and livestock and animals that are permissible to us is simply because ingesting them are good for our bodies. They're not harmful to our bodies. They're positive. And the Rambam says that is true, even with sometimes those that you may think that are just as healthy as another. Maybe you think a pig is just as healthy as a cow. And he says, not so. And he says there are other reasons. For instance, a pig is culturally ugly and is disgusting in terms of its filth, etc. And that is for us an additional reason for that type of species. But by and large, it's simply because God chose and God knows what species are positive for our physical well-being and what aren't. And in fact, he says the signs, split hooves and choose cuts for a behemah, and skins and fins and scales for a fish. Those signs are not what gives that species its substance that is positive or negative for our body. Rather, those are just signs to tell us which ones are the healthy ones, right? So I want to know, God, I want to eat healthy. Which species do you recommend? Well, I'm going to put a label on it so that you'll know which ones I recommend. If it has split hooves and chooses cut, well, then you'll know that's the one that I believe is the more beneficial for your physical well-being. That, says Rambam, is the basic idea behind kashrut in the Moreh Nebuchim. An extension and elaboration of the Rambam's reason is the Abarbanel. Abarbanel goes further to show you how that works. And he'll say, and here he does tie in the symbol or the standard given to us by the Torah with the level of benefit from the animal, the flesh of the animal. So he says, for instance, an animal that chooses cud is given a certain structure in its mouth where it has less ability to tear, to rip, and to eat certain foods, to be carnivorous, and let's say eat other species. And therefore that animal is forced to eat from the ground and to eat what is more benign type, you can say, of ingestion, like grass and plants, etc., and vegetables, right, obviously. And because of that, the actual health of that very animal is better. And its flesh and the way it develops is healthier for the person who's then going to slaughter and eat that animal. And he goes further to say that, by the way, because that animal doesn't kill in order to survive, the very, so to speak, character of that animal, it's less of a cruel type of animal, right? It's something that's more indicative of, you can say, the trait of a Jew and what we might emulate. Not that that is affecting our traits necessarily, but it's more fitting, it's more appropriate for us. And therefore, it's these signs, says the Abarbanel, that are the physical character of the type of species which is beneficial for us when we eat it. And therefore, he's staying on the same track, although he gives more importance to the sign of kashrut, but on the same track of the Rambam, and that is it's physically beneficial to us. Going to another level is the Sefer HaChinuch. The Sefer HaChinuch explains that whether we like it or not, our holy soul is enveloped by our lowly body. Now, our soul isn't physical, but there is an innate connection between body and soul. And therefore, our soul can't release itself from our body. It's it's married against its will, you can say, in this world to our body. And therefore, says the Sefer HaChinuch, also, it's inevitably going to be affected by the decisions of the body. And so the body has to be well kept in an ironic way, have the soul well kept. So that he gives an example. If that which is the mold of a certain utensil to make a certain metallic utensil, let's say a tool, is a mold that's very exact, it's well sculpted, that utensil that goes in that mold will be molded well, will be molded more accurately, will be with more precision, and therefore it'll be in a more appropriate holder and case also for that utensil. So too with the body. If the body is well kept, and the body is more, you can say, precise, and it's maintained well, then the body becomes a more suitable, you can say, holder, vessel, mold, receptacle that stores, so to speak, because it's not a physical, obviously the soul is metaphysical, but stores the soul. And therefore, he says, yes, indeed, these species that are permissible are species that are positive for the body. And because they're positive for the body, they end up being positive for the soul. And conversely speaking, those species that are permissive, they're prohibited, and their intake and their consumption are negative for the body for reasons that Kadosh Baruch Hu knows and we have to discover, they will also inevitably cause harm for the soul as well. Very difficult concept where you are creating a cause and effect system between something that's physical and metaphysical. Hard to imagine. But says the Sefer HaChinuch, that is the arrangement that God put into play for man to be built of body and soul. And therefore, there is an effect of body on soul. And Sefer HaChinuch says, by the way, as you will discover, you will see that it is true that these are physically beneficial species, or conversely speaking, not beneficial to you. And he says that, don't let someone trick you to think that because a certain study came out, it says, well, this is, if eaten this manner or if grown in this place or bred in this area, etc., then it's beneficial to you, to try to make some type of logical deduction. Oh, well, then, if it's not, or in this setting or in this context, it could be okay, or vice versa. And then try to subjectively decide when a species is good or not good for you. He says, in the long run, it'll all rise to the surface, and will be revealed, and everyone will eventually understand why God chose to prohibit or to permit which species that he did. And these are things that slowly will play out and be revealed as time goes on. And there's no question that Kdusha Baruch Hu knew what he was doing, and you can count on it, says the Sefer HaChinuch. But we have another level of understanding now, one that is both a physical and / spiritual reason and objective, the laws, the dietary laws. Finally, let's go to a different track altogether. This Sforno, who bases his comment on the last and comments on the last few Pesukim of the Perashat, where there is a mention of Kdusha, which I will discuss momentarily, sanctity, regarding the laws of kashrut and dietary restrictions and permissibility. And he says very simply, the pasuk tells us, "V'yiten kadoshim ti kadosh ani." You should be sanctified and holy because I am as well. And therefore, these are laws that put into play that when you observe them, you are mimicking, devoting yourself and dedicating yourself to God. Yes, they're chokim without logical reason, but I want you to do these. When you observe them, you are being loyal to me, recognizing me, going in my ways, inevitably becoming like me and becoming kadosh. So for some reason, these specifically, the dietary laws, are those that make us, so to speak, more kadosh than others. And indeed, as this Sforno is pointing out, and we can explicitly see at the end of the parasha, you have this concept brought out of Kdusha. And we really can say that whatever theory that we choose to explain and understand the reason behind the dietary laws, what's uniform to all of them is this pasuk. It's in Perek Yud Aleph, pasuk Mem Dalet, the fourth to last pasuk in the Perashat. When all is said and done, and the dust settles in the dietary laws and all the species, Ki ani Adonai Elohechem, I am your God. V'hit kadishtem, become kadosh. V'yitem, allow yourself to become sanctified. V'yitem kadoshim, then you will become sanctified. Ki kadosh ani, because I am kadosh. Now, at first glance, something that seems very preposterous, because Kdusha and separateness is what makes God separate from us completely. In physicality, he's not bound by space. He's timeless, right? Transcends time. He's separate in every single way that we are not. And how can we become kadosh? Well, by mimicking HaKadosh Baruch Hu, mimicking his ways. This Kdusha, this separateness, is a practice that we practice in our lives that then likens us to Kadosh Baruch Hu on his level, so to speak. And it's fascinating, by the way, that the idea of Kdusha, which we think we use that term to think of more mystical and spiritual and metaphysical ideas, is actually used for the mundane act of eating. Kdusha, separateness and sanctification. And the Rambam himself, in the 14 separate volumes in the Mishneh Torah and books that he has, the one that's labeled Kdusha has laws between the sexes, the men and women, and dietary laws. That is labeled as the practice of Kdusha, because in this big world of ours, with the billions of people that populate the world, what is uniform with all of us is that we have to engage in these physical activities. We have to eat, to consume, to nourish, and therefore to survive. What separates us is by leading a life in which we're disciplined, we're focused, we're limited, and we're therefore separate in the very mundane activity of eating. And that creates Kdusha. That creates this level that elevates us and likens us to God, simply by infusing meaning in the most mundane activities in life. And of all activities, the eating activity is the one that is the paradigm in our Torah Kdusha for Kdusha, for holiness and for sanctity, as we live our separate culture, our distinguished lives, and we obey and we're devoted to HaKadosh Baruch Hu every day of our lives, as we, in a very routine way, ingest our food and eat. We mimic HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and for all the reasons that we mentioned, of course, coexisting and playing out together, we know that this practice of kashrut and dietary laws merits to be called a kadosh activity and to be taking up half of our parasha and to giving us much more meaning in our private lives. Amen v'amen. Shabbat shalom.